Before Reiner Brown became the armored Titan, before he breached the walls of Paradis, before he stood in front of Eren and calmly revealed that he was the enemy, he was simply a boy who wanted to matter. Reiner did not begin his story as a sadistic warrior who dreamed of destroying the people inside the walls. He began as a child who desperately wanted his mother's approval, wanted to escape the stigma attached to his family, and wanted to become someone that other people could be proud of. That desire would eventually carry him all the way to Paradis, where it would become impossible for him to maintain the simple distinction between good and evil that Marley had taught him. To understand why Reiner eventually broke, it is necessary to understand the much simpler desire that existed underneath everything else. Reiner wanted to be a hero. Reiner was born in Liberio, the internment zone where Eldians living under Marleyan rule were confined and treated as second-class citizens. His mother, Reiner Broke, was an Eldian who had entered a relationship with a Marleyan. And because relationships between Eldians and Marleyans were heavily stigmatized, Reiner grew up without the father he wanted. His mother remained convinced that becoming an honorary Marleyan would eventually allow their family to escape the humiliation surrounding their existence. And Reiner absorbed that belief from an early age. He learned that Marley rewarded Eldians who demonstrated exceptional loyalty, particularly those willing to become warriors and inherit one of the 9 Titans. To a child like Reiner, the warrior program offered something that ordinary life could not. It offered recognition. The children chosen as warriors would receive privileges that ordinary Eldians could only dream about, and their families could receive better treatment from Marley. More importantly, Reiner believed becoming a warrior would prove that he was different from the people Marley despised. If he could become one of the children trusted with a Titan, perhaps his mother would finally be proud of him. Perhaps his absent father would have a reason to acknowledge him. Perhaps the people around him would stop seeing him as an unwanted Eldian and start seeing him as someone important. That was the beginning of Reiner's obsession. He did not have the natural talent of some of the other warrior candidates. Annie Leonhardt was exceptionally skilled, disciplined, and physically capable. Peak demonstrated intelligence and adaptability. Marcel Galliard was respected and confident. Even Porco, despite his arrogance, possessed considerable natural ability. Reiner was different. He struggled, he made mistakes, and he was not initially viewed as one of the strongest candidates. Yet he kept going. The more Reiner struggled, the more important becoming a warrior became to him, because failure would not simply mean losing a competition. In his mind, failure meant losing the possibility of becoming someone worthy of respect. His identity gradually became attached to the idea that he had to prove himself. And this is where Reiner's psychology begins to become important. He did not simply want to succeed. He needed success to tell him that his life had value. That distinction would eventually become devastating. Reiner was eventually selected as one of the warriors and inherited the armored Titan. For a boy who had spent years believing that he was inferior, this should have been the moment when everything finally came together. He had achieved what he wanted. His mother could be proud. Marley could recognize him. He had been entrusted with one of the most powerful weapons in the world. But becoming a warrior did not make Reiner feel secure. Instead, it placed an enormous responsibility on a child who had never developed the emotional stability necessary to carry it. Reiner was still young when Marley sent him and the other warriors toward Paradis. Their mission was not simply to explore the island. They were expected to infiltrate the population, locate the founding Titan, and recover it for Marley. The children were being sent into an environment where they would potentially have to kill innocent people, destroy cities, and betray anyone who trusted them. Marley presented this mission through a simple narrative. The people inside the walls were dangerous Eldian devils. The founder was a weapon that could threaten the world. The warriors were heroes who had been chosen to protect civilization. For Reiner, this narrative was comforting because it gave moral meaning to what he was being asked to do. He did not have to think of himself as a child being sent to kill strangers. He could think of himself as a hero carrying out an important mission. That distinction would become crucial once he actually met the people he had been taught to hate. But before that happened, Reiner experienced the first major psychological blow of his journey. The warriors had barely begun their mission when Marcel was eaten by Ymir. Marcel had been more than another warrior candidate. He was the person who had protected Reiner during the selection process and had secretly influenced the decision that allowed Reiner to inherit the armored Titan. Marcel had a complicated relationship with his younger brother, Porco, and had chosen to sacrifice his own brother's chances in order to protect him. Reiner did not know the full extent of this manipulation at the time, but he knew that Marcel had been the group sweater and one of the people holding everything together. Then Marcel died. Suddenly, the children who had been sent to Paradis were missing the person who had been guiding them. Annie wanted to continue the mission. Reiner insisted that they had to keep moving. But beneath his confidence was something far more fragile. Reiner was terrified. He had been given the armored Titan because he was supposed to be a hero. Yet now, he was responsible for completing a mission that had already begun falling apart. He could have turned around. He could have admitted that they were children who were not prepared for what Marley had asked them to do. Instead, Reiner pushed forward because turning back would mean admitting that he had failed. And failure was something Reiner could not tolerate. He had spent his entire childhood building his identity around the idea that becoming a warrior would prove his worth. Now, the mission was the ultimate test of that identity. So, he continued. When the warriors finally reached the walls, Reiner was still carrying the same belief that had brought him there. He believed that the people inside were enemies. He believed that destroying the wall was necessary. He believed that completing the mission would justify everything that had happened. At that point, Reiner had no idea how difficult it would become to maintain those beliefs. Because once he entered the walls, he did not meet monsters. He met children. He trained beside them. He ate with them. He laughed with them. He watched them struggle, dream, argue, and form friendships. And slowly, without realizing it, Reiner began becoming one of them. That was the beginning of the fracture inside his mind. The warrior identity told him that these people were enemies. The soldier identity that developed inside the walls told him that they were comrades. At first, Reiner could keep those identities separate because he still believed the mission had a clear purpose. But every friendship made the contradiction harder to ignore. Every person he grew attached to became another piece of evidence to us that the world was not as simple as Marley had told him. The tragedy was that Reiner never had the emotional freedom to stop and process that contradiction. He could not admit that he was beginning to care about the people he had been sent to destroy, because doing so would mean questioning the entire purpose of his mission, his warrior identity, his mother's expectations, and the sacrifices that had already been made. So, instead of resolving the contradiction, Reiner buried it. He became the person he believed everyone needed him to be. The strong warrior, the reliable soldier, the brave friend, the hero. And the deeper those identities became, the more impossible it would eventually be for Reiner to tell where one ended and the other began. Years later, when he finally stood in front of Eren and revealed the truth, it would appear almost absurdly simple. Reiner was the armored Titan. Reiner had destroyed the walls. Reiner had helped kill thousands of people. But the real tragedy was not that Reiner had been pretending to be someone's friend. It was that, somewhere along the way, he had stopped knowing which version of himself was pretending. And that confusion would eventually become the reason he broke. Reiner's path to becoming the armored Titan began long before he ever reached Paradis. And the most important part of that journey was not his physical training, but the way the warrior program transformed his understanding of himself. Marley had created a system where Eldian children were taught that serving the nation could redeem their families, earn them privileges, and prove that they were different from the rest of their people. For Reiner, that message was especially powerful because he desperately wanted to escape the shame surrounding his family. Becoming a warrior was not simply a career. It was the answer to nearly every insecurity he had carried since childhood. The warrior candidates were constantly compared against one another, and Reiner quickly discovered that he was not naturally gifted. Annie was an exceptional fighter. Porco possessed tremendous ability, and Marcel was trusted as a leader. Reiner, meanwhile, often struggled to keep up. He was physically capable, but he lacked the natural confidence and talent that made some of the others stand out. That weakness became important because Reiner responded to failure in a very specific way. Instead of questioning whether the warrior system itself was worth pursuing, he became more determined to prove that he belonged in it. Every setback became another reason to work harder. Every criticism became another reason to prove himself. And every comparison with the other candidates made the possibility of failure feel more personal. Reiner's mother reinforced this mindset. She wanted her son to become an honorary Marleyan. And Reiner believed that achieving warrior status would finally give their family the acceptance they had always wanted. He imagined that his father might eventually recognize him, and that his mother would be able to look at him with pride. The irony was that Reiner's desire to become a hero was built partly on a child's belief that achievement could fix the emotional wounds of his family. That belief made him extremely vulnerable to the warrior system. Marley did not need to force Reiner to become loyal through violence alone. It gave him something he desperately wanted, and then connected that reward to obedience. If he succeeded, his family would benefit. If he failed, he would remain an ordinary Eldian, living under discrimination. The choice, therefore, felt obvious to him. Eventually, Reiner was selected to inherit the armored Titan. For a child who had spent years feeling inferior, this should have been the moment when his insecurity disappeared. Instead, it gave him something even more dangerous: responsibility. The armored Titan was one of the 9 Titans, and inheriting it meant that Reiner was no longer simply trying to prove himself in training. He was now expected to become one of Marley's most important military assets. The title of warrior also changed the way Reiner viewed himself. He began thinking of himself as someone who had a duty to perform, someone whose personal feelings could not interfere with the mission. This was reinforced by Marley's propaganda, which presented the warriors as heroic Eldians fighting to protect the world from the supposed threat represented by Paradis. Reiner needed to believe that story. If the people inside the walls were monsters, then killing them was not murder. If the mission was protecting the world, then destroying the walls was heroic. If Reiner was a warrior, then the sacrifices required of him had meaning. The simplicity of that worldview allowed him to move forward. But the mission itself was far more complicated than the propaganda suggested. Reiner, Annie, Marcel, and Bertolt were sent to Paradis with a clear objective: infiltrate the island, locate the founding Titan, and return it to Marley. They were children being sent into enemy territory, but Marley had given them enough training and ideology to make them believe they were prepared. In reality, none of them understood what the mission would do to them psychologically. They had been trained to think of the people of Paradis as enemies. They had not been trained to live among them. That difference would eventually destroy Reiner. The journey itself began going wrong almost immediately. Marcel, who had been the most experienced member of the group, and the person Reiner depended on more than he realized, was eaten by Ymir after pushing Reiner out of the Titan's path. His death left the others in shock, but it affected Reiner in a particularly damaging way. Reiner now believed that Marcel had died because of him. He had failed to protect the person who had protected him. For a moment, the mission could have ended there. Annie wanted to return to Marley, and the group had every reason to believe that continuing without Marcel was too dangerous. But Reiner refused. He insisted that they continue. This decision is one of the earliest examples of Reiner's inability to accept failure. Returning to Marley meant admitting that Marcel had died for nothing, and that Reiner had been unable to complete the mission he had been trusted with. Continuing forward allowed him to transform that guilt into purpose. If they completed the mission, then Marcel's death would have meaning. If Reiner succeeded, then he had not failed. So they continued toward the walls. When Reiner eventually helped breach Wall Maria, he was still operating according to the simple worldview Marley had given him. He believed that destroying the wall was part of a heroic mission, even though he could not possibly understand the full consequences of what he was doing. The attack killed civilians, displaced entire populations, and created the very circumstances that would eventually place him in direct contact with the people he had been taught to hate. Reiner entered Paradis believing he knew who the enemy was. He had no idea that the people he was about to meet would make that certainty almost impossible to maintain. After the fall of Wall Maria, the warriors infiltrated the military and eventually entered the 104th Cadet Corps. Reiner now had to live among the people he had been sent to destroy. He trained beside them, ate beside them, fought alongside them, and gradually became part of their daily lives. And Reiner was surprisingly good at becoming the person others needed. He was physically strong. He appeared dependable. He encouraged younger recruits. He acted like an older brother toward the others. He became someone people could rely on. At first, this was simply useful. Reiner needed to maintain his cover, and gaining the trust of the soldiers made it easier to remain hidden. But something began happening that Marley had never prepared him for. Reiner started genuinely caring about them. The people he had been told were devils became his friends. The soldiers he was supposed to deceive became his comrades. The island he had been taught to hate became a place where he had memories. And the longer he remained there, the more difficult it became to maintain the belief that he was simply an enemy infiltrator completing a mission. Instead of resolving that contradiction, Reiner began separating himself into different identities. There was Reiner the warrior, the son who wanted to make Marley proud and complete his mission. And there was Reiner the soldier, the dependable comrade who genuinely wanted to protect the people around him. At first, this division helped him survive. Eventually, it would become the source of his collapse, because Reiner was not simply pretending to be a soldier. Part of him had actually become one. And by the time the mission demanded that he choose between those two identities, Reiner would no longer be capable of making that choice without destroying something inside himself. When Reiner arrived on Paradis, he still believed the mission was simple. Marley had sent him, Annie, Bertolt, and Marcel to infiltrate the island, locate the founding Titan, and return with its power. They had been taught that the people inside the walls were dangerous Eldians who threatened the outside world, while the warriors were heroes carrying out a necessary duty. Reiner needed that story to be true, because it gave meaning to everything he had sacrificed. He had trained for years, inherited the armored Titan, and left his family behind. If the people of Paradis were not monsters, then Reiner would eventually have to question why he had been sent there to destroy them. The first thing that shattered Reiner's confidence was losing Marcel. The warriors had barely begun their journey when a pure titan attacked them. Marcel realized that Reiner was about to be eaten and pushed him out of the way. Marcel was swallowed instead, leaving Reiner, Annie, and Bertolt without the person who had been guiding them. His death affected Reiner deeply because Marcel had protected him before, and Reiner knew that Marcel had died trying to save him. Annie wanted to return to Marley. Reiner refused. That decision tells us a great deal about the person Reiner already was. He was not simply being brave. He was terrified of returning home as a failure. Marcel had died saving him, and if Reiner abandoned the mission, then that sacrifice would feel meaningless. Turning back would mean admitting that he was not the hero he had promised himself and his mother he would become. So, Reiner convinced the others to continue. From that moment forward, he was carrying more than the armored titan: guilt. The warriors eventually reached the walls, and Reiner helped carry out the attack that caused the fall of Wall Maria. Thousands of people died, families were separated, and an entire population was forced from its home. Marley had given Reiner a simple explanation for why those deaths were acceptable. The people of Paradis were enemies, and the mission was necessary. Yet the first contradiction was already forming. Reiner had killed people he had never met for a country that did not truly accept him. He had done it because he believed becoming a warrior would finally make him worthy. Then he had to live among the people he had helped destroy. After infiltrating the military, Reiner entered the 104th Cadet Corps alongside Annie and Bertolt. This was where everything began changing. The people he had been taught to hate were no longer distant figures behind a wall. They were teenagers who trained beside him, joked with him, became frightened, and dreamed about their futures. They were human. Reiner could not turn that realization off. He became close to the other cadets, particularly Eren. Reiner was supposed to view Eren as an enemy, yet he gradually respected his determination and began treating him like a genuine friend. He also became a dependable older brother to the recruits. At first, this helped maintain his cover. Eventually, it stopped being an act. That distinction is essential to understanding what happened inside Reiner. He had created the soldier identity as a disguise, but the longer he lived inside it, the more real it became. Reiner was not simply pretending to care. He actually cared. The warrior inside him remembered the mission. The soldier inside him wanted his comrades to survive. For a while, Reiner could keep those desires separate. Then, Eren transformed. During the Battle of Trost, Reiner discovered that the Titan they had been searching for was not some distant monster hidden somewhere on the island. Eren, the person Reiner had trained beside and begun to trust, could transform into a Titan. This should have made the mission easier. Instead, it made everything worse. Eren was now both things at once: the person Marley had ordered Reiner to capture, and the friend Reiner had come to care about. Every time Reiner looked at him, those two realities existed simultaneously. The mission demanded that he think of Eren as a weapon. while life inside the walls demanded that he think of him as a comrade. Reiner's mind began creating a separation between those two realities. There was Reiner the warrior, who belonged to Marley and had a mission to complete. Then there was Reiner the soldier, who belonged to the people of Paradis and genuinely wanted to protect them. The separation allowed him to function. If the soldier cared about his friends, the warrior did not have to think about it. And if the warrior wanted to complete the mission, the soldier did not have to accept what that meant. But every new experience made the contradiction stronger. The people inside the walls were not monsters. They were ordinary people who trusted him and considered him a friend. That created a psychological problem Reiner could not solve. If he admitted that they were innocent, then he had to question everything. Why had Marcel died? Why had Wall Maria been destroyed? Why had thousands of people been killed? Why had he spent years betraying people who trusted him? And most importantly, why had he done all of it? The answers were supposed to be simple. He was a warrior. Marley needed him. Paradis was dangerous, but his own experiences were constantly contradicting those answers. So Reiner buried the contradiction instead of resolving it. He continued acting like the strong soldier. He continued believing that he had a responsibility to finish the mission. He continued telling himself that everything had a purpose. The problem was that the soldier identity was no longer simply a disguise. It had become part of Reiner himself. He had memories on Paradis that were just as real as his memories in Marley. He had friendships that were genuine. He had people he wanted to protect. And yet, the warrior was still there, waiting. Eventually, those two identities would collide directly. Reiner would stand in front of Eren, the person he had trained beside for years, and reveal the truth. He was the armored Titan. He had breached the wall. He had helped destroy their home. The shocking part was how strangely casual the confession seemed. By then, his mind had become so divided that he was no longer experiencing the moment as one complete identity. The warrior was confessing. The soldier was still thinking about his comrades, and Reiner himself was trapped somewhere between them. That fracture had not appeared overnight. It had been building ever since he chose to continue the mission after Marcel died. For Reiner, the most damaging part of the Paradis mission was not the destruction of Wall Maria or even Marcel's death. It was what happened afterward, when he had to live among the people he had been taught to hate. Marley had given him a simple story. The people inside the walls were dangerous Eldians, and the warriors were heroes, protecting the world by recovering the founding Titan. That story was easy to believe while Paradis remained distant. It became much harder to believe once Reiner began eating with these people, training beside them, laughing with them, and watching them risk their lives for one another. When Reiner joined the 104th Cadet Corps, he quickly became someone others depended on. John respected him, Connie looked up to him, and Eren eventually came to see him as a reliable friend. Reiner embraced that role because it gave him something he had wanted since childhood. He felt useful. He felt respected. there was a cruel irony in that. Reiner had joined the warrior program because he wanted to become a hero. Inside the walls, he finally started feeling like one. The problem was that the people giving him that feeling were the same people he had been sent to destroy. Every day with the cadets added another layer to the contradiction inside his mind. They were not monsters. They were teenagers dealing with fear, loss, friendship, and uncertainty, just as Reiner had. They complained about training, competed with each other, talked about their families, and tried to imagine a future where they could survive. Reiner could no longer reduce them to the image Marley had given him. They were individuals. And once Reiner knew them as individuals, killing them became psychologically different. Eren was especially important. Reiner recognized something familiar in his determination. Eren hated feeling powerless and refused to accept a life controlled by others, while Reiner had spent his own childhood desperately trying to prove that he mattered. Reiner respected Eren's stubbornness and gradually began treating him as a genuine friend. That became a serious problem when Eren transformed into a Titan. The warriors had spent years searching for the Titan power they needed to complete their mission. Now they had found someone who possessed enormous power. But that person was not a stranger. He was Eren, the boy Reiner had trained beside and grown close to. The mission suddenly had a face. Reiner could no longer pretend that the people of Paradis were simply targets. The person he needed to capture was someone he genuinely cared about. The same contradiction existed with the rest of the cadets. When Reiner protected them, he was not always acting. When he worried about them, he was not pretending. Their injuries frightened him, their victories made him proud, and their deaths affected him. This was when the distinction between Reiner the warrior and Reiner the soldier became increasingly important. He had originally created the soldier identity as a disguise, but years of living inside that role had changed him. The soldier was no longer simply an act. Reiner had developed genuine memories and attachments as that person. The warrior remembered Marley. The soldier remembered Paradis. The warrior knew the mission had to be completed. The soldier wanted his comrades to survive. Reiner could not simply choose between them because both sides had become emotionally real. He remembered his mother's expectations, the pride he once felt after inheriting the armored Titan, and Marcel's death. But he also remembered eating with his friends, training with them, and protecting them. Neither life was completely fake anymore. That made the mission increasingly impossible. The Battle of Trost pushed Reiner further. Reiner was forced to fight alongside the same soldiers he had secretly betrayed. Every time he protected someone, he strengthened his connection to Paradis. While every time he remembered his mission, he was reminded that those connections had been built on deception. Then Eren revealed his Titan power. For Reiner, the discovery should have been a victory. The warriors had finally found someone connected to the power they were searching for. Instead, it created an unbearable choice. If Reiner captured Eren, he would fulfill his promise to Marley. But he would also betray his friend. If he protected Eren, he would be protecting the people Marley had ordered him to destroy. But he would also betray his family, his country, and the identity he had built his entire life around. And if he did nothing, he would fail everyone. The important point is that Reiner had not forgotten his mission. He remembered it perfectly. His problem was that he had stopped emotionally believing in it. That distinction explains why his mind began separating the two identities. When Reiner was acting as a soldier, he could care about his comrades without thinking about Marley. When he remembered himself as a warrior, he could focus on the mission without confronting the people he had grown attached to. The separation allowed him to keep functioning, but it also prevented him from confronting the real question: who was he actually fighting for? The answer had once been easy. He was fighting for Marley. Then he began fighting for the people beside him. Eventually, he was fighting for both. Reiner had spent his childhood believing that becoming a warrior would finally give him a clear identity. Instead, the role that was supposed to make him feel important had fractured his sense of self. He wanted to be a hero, but living on Paradis forced him to understand that heroism depended entirely on perspective. To Marley, Reiner was a hero fighting dangerous Eldians. To the people inside the walls, he was a trusted friend and soldier. To Reiner himself, he was becoming both. And the longer he remained on the island, the harder it became to keep those identities separated. The Survey Corps was getting closer to the truth, and Reiner knew that eventually he would have to act. He could not remain inside the 104th forever while pretending nothing was wrong. The mission was approaching its final decision, but Reiner was no longer capable of making that decision as one unified person. The warrior wanted to finish the mission. The soldier wanted to protect his friends. And Reiner Brown was trapped between them. By the time Reiner reached the point where his two identities were beginning to collide, the difference between the warrior and the soldier was no longer something he could control. He had entered Paradis intending to deceive everyone around him, but years of living alongside the 104th Cadet Corps had changed what began as an act into something genuine. Reiner still remembered Marley, his mother, Marcel, and the mission that had brought him to the island. But he also remembered the people who had become his friends. The problem was that both sides of his life now felt real, and Reiner had no way to reconcile them. The events surrounding the female Titan made that conflict even worse. When Annie began hunting Eren, Reiner understood what was happening from the perspective of the warrior. Eren was their target, and Annie was trying to capture him. Yet Reiner was also watching the situation as a soldier who had spent years fighting beside Eren. He knew how much Eren had changed since joining the military, how many people trusted him, and how many soldiers were willing to risk their lives to protect him. Reiner therefore found himself caught between two completely different instincts. One told him to help Annie. The other told him to protect his comrades. This contradiction became particularly visible during the struggle against the female Titan. Reiner fought alongside the other soldiers and helped protect them, even though every victory they achieved was technically making it harder for him to complete his actual mission. He was becoming increasingly invested in the survival of people he was supposed to betray. That was the real danger of his time inside the walls. Reiner was not simply gathering information. He was becoming attached. The longer he stayed, the more difficult it became to return to the mindset he had possessed when he first arrived. He had originally imagined that infiltrating Paradis would be temporary. He would complete the mission, return to Marley, receive recognition, and finally prove himself. Instead, the island had become the place where most of his strongest memories now existed. He had friends there. He had accomplishments there. He had experienced genuine belonging there. And this created an increasingly painful question. If Paradis had become the place where Reiner felt most accepted, what exactly was he fighting to return to? Marley had promised him recognition, but the people of Paradis had given him something much more personal. They had given him a place. This is why Reiner's relationship with Eren became so important. Eren represented the conflict in its purest form. Reiner could respect him as a friend, while simultaneously knowing that Marley considered him an enemy who needed to be captured. Eren's personality also reminded Reiner of himself. Both were driven by powerful emotions, both hated weakness, and both were willing to push themselves beyond their limits. The difference was that Eren had someone Reiner increasingly lacked, a clear sense of what he wanted. Eren wanted freedom. Reiner wanted everyone to be satisfied with him. That difference mattered. Reiner's identity had always been built around other people's expectations. He wanted his mother to be proud. He wanted Marley to recognize him. He wanted to be seen as a hero. Inside the military, he wanted to be a dependable comrade. He constantly changed himself, depending on what he believed others needed from him. Eventually, there was almost nothing left underneath those roles. This helps explain why Reiner could continue functioning despite the enormous contradiction in his life. He was not consciously deciding every morning to pretend to be someone else. His mind had adapted to the situation by allowing different parts of his personality to dominate at different times. When he was with the cadets, he could genuinely become the soldier. When he thought about Marley, he could return to being the warrior. The problem was that the boundaries between them were becoming weaker. The soldier began remembering things the warrior could not ignore. The warrior began carrying guilt that the soldier could not escape. Eventually, Reiner began showing signs that he was no longer fully aware of the contradiction. He could talk about the mission and then immediately behave like an ordinary soldier among his friends. He could think about betraying them while simultaneously feeling responsible for keeping them safe. This was not simply deception anymore. It was psychological survival. Reiner needed both identities because accepting the whole truth at once would have been unbearable. If he admitted that the people of Paradis were innocent, then he had to accept responsibility for the destruction of Wall Maria. If he insisted that Marley was right, then he had to accept that the people he loved were enemies. Either conclusion threatened the identity he had spent his entire childhood constructing. So he remained divided. That division became especially dangerous when Reiner and Bertolt finally realized that their time on Paradis was running out. The Survey Corps was learning more about the Titans. Aaron's abilities were becoming harder to hide, and the warriors could no longer remain undercover indefinitely. They needed to act. For Bertolt, the mission remained painful, but comparatively clear. He understood that what they were doing was horrible, but he continued because he believed there was no other choice. Reiner was different. He was beginning to lose the ability to see the mission as something separate from himself. When the moment finally arrived for Reiner to reveal his identity, he did not behave like someone making a carefully calculated decision. There was an almost disturbing casualness to it, as if the thought had simply slipped out before he could stop himself. That moment makes much more sense when viewed through everything that had happened beforehand. Reiner had spent years switching between two identities. He had become so accustomed to living as the soldier that the warrior could no longer completely control him. When he looked at Aaron, he saw both a target and a friend. When he looked at the other soldiers, he saw both enemies and comrades. When he thought about Marley, he felt both loyalty and resentment. His mind had reached a point where these contradictions could no longer remain separated. And this is why Reiner's confession is so important. He did not suddenly decide that he wanted to betray his friends. He did not suddenly decide that he wanted to reveal himself. His psychological state had simply reached a point where maintaining the separation required more effort than he could sustain. The soldier had become too real. The warrior had become too painful. And Reiner was caught between them. For years, he had wanted to become a hero because he believed heroes were people who knew exactly what they were fighting for. Now, he was a warrior who no longer understood his enemy, a soldier who had betrayed his comrades, and a young man who could no longer tell which side of the conflict deserved his loyalty. The mission that was supposed to prove Reiner's worth had instead destroyed the certainty that had defined him. And the worst part was that his mission was not finished. He still had to face Aaron. He still had to return to Marley. And eventually, he would have to live with everything he had done. Reiner's confession did not happen because he suddenly decided to betray Marley. And it was not simply a moment of carelessness from an otherwise perfectly controlled spy. By the time he finally revealed himself, the psychological separation between the warrior and the soldier had already become so unstable that Reiner was barely capable of keeping the two identities apart. For years, he had been carrying the same contradiction. He had been sent to Paradis to destroy these people, yet he had spent years becoming one of them. He had trained beside Aaron, eaten with him, fought alongside him, and watched friends die around him. When Reiner finally said that he was the armored Titan, the words sounded strangely casual, because inside his mind, the revelation was not being experienced as a dramatic betrayal. It was almost as though the warrior was speaking, while the soldier remained present at the same time. To understand why that happened on that particular day, the first thing to remember is what Reiner had been going through immediately beforehand. The warriors were under increasing pressure. Their identities were becoming harder to protect, and Aaron had already become the the center of the conflict. Reiner knew that continuing to remain undercover would eventually become impossible. He and Bertolt needed to recover Aaron and return to Marley. But every passing day made that objective more emotionally difficult. Reiner had also become deeply attached to the people around him, meaning that the mission was no longer an abstract duty. It required him to personally betray people who trusted him. The longer he delayed, the more unbearable that choice became. Then came the conversation with Aaron on top of the wall. On the surface, the moment is bizarre. Reiner speaks to Aaron almost like an ordinary friend, and then calmly tells him that he and Bertolt are the armored and colossal titans. There is no grand speech, no dramatic build-up, and no obvious sign that Reiner is preparing to reveal the greatest secret he has protected for years. That strange calmness is precisely what makes the scene so revealing. Reiner is not behaving like a healthy person making a calculated decision. He is behaving like someone whose psychological defenses have begun collapsing. By this point, Reiner's soldier identity had become deeply embedded in his mind. He had spent years being treated as a trusted member of the 104th, and those relationships were no longer imaginary. He genuinely believed that he was responsible for the people around him. At the same time, his warrior identity still demanded that he complete the mission. These identities could coexist only as long as Reiner kept them separated. But the conversation with Aaron placed him in a situation where the two sides were forced into direct contact. Aaron was standing in front of him as both a friend and the target he needed to capture. There was no longer enough psychological distance between the two roles to keep them isolated. There is another reason that particular moment mattered. Reiner was trying to convince himself that returning to Marley was still possible. He had been carrying guilt for years, and one of the easiest ways to avoid confronting that guilt was to focus on the mission as something that simply had to be completed. If he could capture Aaron, return home, and finish what he had started, then perhaps everything that happened on Paradis could become something he could leave behind. But saying the truth aloud created a strange kind of release. For a brief moment, Reiner no longer had to maintain the lie. He could stop pretending that he was simply another soldier. He could acknowledge the warrior without having to hide him. That is why the confession feels almost like a relief rather than a threat. Reiner was exhausted. He had spent years maintaining an impossible double life, and his mind had already begun protecting itself by allowing the two identities to operate separately. When he finally spoke, the boundary between them simply gave way. He did not need to consciously decide that he was going to betray everyone. The thought emerged because the psychological pressure had reached a point where continuing the performance was becoming harder than revealing the truth. This is also why Reiner's behavior afterward becomes so important. Once the truth is exposed, the psychological separation that had allowed him to function begins to collapse. He can no longer comfortably return to the soldier identity because the people around him now know what he has done. At the same time, he cannot simply become the confident warrior he imagined himself to be, because he has spent too many years caring about the people he was ordered to destroy. The identities that once protected him now trap him. Reiner's confession, therefore, represents much more than the reveal of his Titan power. It is the moment when his mind can no longer maintain the illusion that these two lives can remain separate. The warrior has to face the soldier, and the soldier has to face the warrior. Reiner is forced to recognize that both are parts of him, and neither can be dismissed as completely fake. Reiner had spent his childhood wanting to become a hero, believing that heroes were people who carried out their duty despite fear. On Paradis, he discovered that duty could place him against people he genuinely loved, leaving him with a question he could no longer avoid. Was completing the mission actually worth what it required? That question had no answer that allowed him to remain innocent. If Marley was right, Reiner had betrayed his friends. If Paradis was right, he had spent years helping destroy innocent people. If both sides were more complicated than the story he had been taught, then everything he had sacrificed his childhood for became uncertain. That uncertainty is what finally broke through during his conversation with Eren. The confession was not the beginning of Reiner's collapse. It was the visible moment of a collapse that had been happening for years. Afterward, there was no going back. The people Reiner had deceived knew the truth. The mission was finally moving toward open conflict, and the psychological walls he had built inside himself were beginning to fall apart. He would eventually return to Marley, carrying the memories of Paradis with him. But he would not return as the same person who had left. The warrior had completed his mission only in the sense that the truth had finally been exposed. The soldier had lost his friends, and Reiner was left carrying the guilt of both. Returning to Marley should have been a victory for Reiner. He had survived Paradis and returned to his family. But psychologically, Reiner was nothing like the boy who had left Liberio years earlier. He had spent so long switching between the identities of warrior and soldier that returning home did not restore the person he used to be. On Paradis, he could be a soldier among his friends and a warrior in his own mind. In Marley, there was no need for the soldier anymore. Yet Reiner could not simply erase everything he had experienced. His family expected him to be proud of becoming a successful warrior. But Reiner carried memories that nobody around him could fully understand. He remembered the people inside the walls as real human beings, rather than enemies from Marley's propaganda. He remembered Eren, Armin, John, Connie, Sasha, and the others as people he had lived beside. He remembered Marcel's death and knew that the mission had begun with his own refusal to turn back. Every part of his life on Paradis remained inside his head, even though Marley expected him to simply return to normal. This is where Reiner's guilt became much more destructive. Before Paradis, he could believe that the things he was doing were necessary because he had never personally known the people affected by them. After Paradis, he knew exactly who they were. He had looked into their faces, eaten beside them, protected them, and watched them die. The attack on Wall Maria could no longer remain an abstract military operation. Reiner understood what it meant because he had spent years living among the people who suffered from it. He had become both the person responsible for their suffering and someone who genuinely cared about them. That contradiction became unbearable after his return. Reiner began experiencing severe psychological distress, and his family noticed that something was wrong, even if they did not understand the full reason. The boy who had once desperately wanted to become a hero had returned from the mission, unable to see himself as one. Instead, he saw someone who had deceived people who trusted him and helped destroy their homes. The identity he had spent his childhood building around being a warrior now felt like a source of shame. Reiner's depression was not caused by one traumatic event, but by years of contradiction. Marcel's death, the destruction of Wall Maria, the deaths of soldiers, the friendships he formed, the betrayal of Aaron, and the people he had killed all existed together in his mind. There was no single memory he could remove to make himself feel better. His suffering came from understanding too much. Reiner also began to believe that his own existence was dangerous to the people around him. He had seen what happened when children were turned into weapons. Now, he was watching the next generation of warrior candidates being prepared to repeat the same cycle. Gabi and Falco reminded him of his younger self, particularly the way they believed that becoming warriors would make them worthy of respect. Reiner could see the same trap waiting for them because he had already lived through it. That realization deepened his guilt. He had once wanted the title of warrior because he believed it would save his family. But now he understood that the system had used that desire to turn children into weapons. He also knew he had helped perpetuate that cycle. Eventually, the pressure became so severe that Reiner attempted to take his own life. This moment is often reduced to simple depression. But the deeper reason was that Reiner had reached a point where he believed his continued existence could only create more suffering. He did not see a meaningful future waiting for him. He could not undo what he had done or escape his role as a warrior. Yet even here, Reiner's story contains an important contradiction. He survived. His mother discovered what was happening, and the presence of his family interrupted the final step. His guilt did not disappear, but he was forced to continue living. That would eventually become one of the central questions of Reiner's life. If he could not change the past, what could he possibly do with the time he had left? The answer came through Gabi and Falco, who still had the possibility of escaping that mindset. Reiner began seeing himself in them, and that resemblance forced him to confront his own childhood. He had once been desperate to make his mother proud, and now he was watching the same system shape another generation. For perhaps the first time, Reiner began understanding that his worth did not have to come from being a warrior. He did not need to be a hero. He did not need to prove himself through sacrifice. He did not need to justify his existence by completing someone else's mission. But understanding that did not erase his guilt. He continued carrying the consequences of his actions. He no longer fights because he believes victory will prove that he deserves to exist. He fights because there are people he wants to protect, even when he no longer believes that he himself deserves protection. Reiner does not suddenly become confident or free from his trauma. He remains exhausted and aware of his failures. Yet he continues moving forward because he has finally found something stronger than his desire to become a hero. He has found responsibility toward other people. Reiner once believed that being a hero meant becoming someone worthy of admiration. By the end of his life, he begins to understand that it can mean something much quieter, continuing to protect others even when nobody is going to praise you for it. The boy who wanted to be a hero had broken because the world proved that the role he wanted did not exist in the simple way he imagined. The man who survived that collapse slowly discovered that he could still choose what to do with the life that remained. By the time Reiner entered the final stage of the conflict, he was no longer the same person who had breached Wall Maria as a child. He still carried the memories of Marley, Marcel, and the years he spent pretending to be a soldier. But something fundamental had changed. Reiner no longer believed that becoming a hero would make his life meaningful, and he no longer believed that completing a mission could erase what he had done. He had already experienced the consequences of both beliefs. What remained was a much harder question. If he could not change the past, what reason did he have to keep living? The answer gradually became the people around him. Gabi and Falco were especially important because Reiner recognized himself in both of them. They were children being shaped by the same system that had shaped him, taught to believe that becoming warriors would make them valuable, and that the people on the other side of the conflict were their enemies. Reiner could see exactly where that path could lead, because he had already walked it. His relationship with Gabi was therefore complicated. He cared deeply about her, but he also understood that her determination and hatred were partly products of the same propaganda that had once controlled him. For Reiner, protecting them became different from protecting Marley. He was no longer trying to prove that he deserved to be called a hero. He was trying to prevent another child from becoming what he had become. That change in motivation was crucial. Reiner eventually returned to the battlefield, even though he had every reason to fear it. He knew what the armored titan represented, and he knew that fighting meant reopening memories he had spent years trying to survive. Yet when the world reached its final crisis, Reiner did not simply disappear. He continued fighting alongside people who had once been his enemies, because he understood that the conflict had become larger than Marley or Paradis. This was especially meaningful during the battle against Eren. Reiner once believed Eren was the enemy he had been sent to capture. Later, Eren became someone he had fought beside, betrayed, and ultimately understood better than almost anyone could. Their relationship had traveled from friendship to hatred, and eventually toward something more complicated. Reiner understood that Eren was also trapped by a world that had given him impossible choices. That did not excuse what Eren did, just as understanding Reiner did not excuse his own actions. But Reiner had finally learned that people could be both victims and perpetrators at the same time. During the final battle, Reiner repeatedly put himself in danger to protect others. The armored Titan, which had once been a symbol of his value as a warrior, became something different. It was no longer simply Marley's weapon. Reiner used it to protect people who had nothing to do with Marley, and who, under different circumstances, might have been his enemies. That transformation gave the armored Titan a completely different meaning. Reiner had inherited the armor because he wanted recognition. He eventually used it because he had something worth protecting. The distinction may seem small, but it represents the entire evolution of his character. The boy who inherited the Titan wanted someone to tell him that he was important. The man who carried it into the final battle already understood that his worth did not depend on recognition. He simply kept going. And that is what makes Reiner's survival so important. After everything he endured, death would have been an easy conclusion to his story. Reiner spent a long time believing that Ying might be the only way to escape his guilt. He had reached a point where he could barely imagine living with his memories, and his suicide attempt demonstrated just how completely hopeless he had become. But Reiner eventually discovered that surviving was not necessarily about forgetting. It was about carrying the past without allowing it to determine every decision. He could not undo Wall Maria. He could not bring Marcel back. He could not erase the people who died because of his actions. He could not become the innocent child he had once been. But he could decide what he did with the life that remained. By the time Reiner entered the final stage of the conflict, he was no longer the same person who had breached Wall Maria as a child. He still carried the memories of Marley, Marcel, and the years he spent pretending to be a soldier. But something fundamental had changed. Reiner no longer believed that becoming a hero would make his life meaningful, and he no longer believed that completing a mission could erase what he had done. He had already experienced the consequences of both beliefs. What remained was a much harder question. If he could not change the past, what reason did he have to keep living? The answer gradually became the people around him. Gabi and Falco were especially important because Reiner recognized himself in both of them. They were children being shaped by the same system that had shaped him, taught to believe that becoming warriors would make them valuable, and that the people on the other side of the conflict were their enemies. Reiner could see exactly where that path could lead, because he had already walked it. His relationship with Gabi was therefore complicated. He cared deeply about her, but he also understood that her determination and hatred were partly products of the same propaganda that had once controlled him. For Reiner, protecting them became different from protecting Marley. He was no longer trying to prove that he deserved to be called a hero. He was trying to prevent another child from becoming what he had become. That change in motivation was crucial. Reiner eventually returned to the battlefield, even though he had every reason to fear it. He knew what the armored Titan represented, and he knew that fighting meant reopening memories he had spent years trying to survive. Yet when the world reached its final crisis, Reiner did not simply disappear. He continued fighting alongside people who had once been his enemies, because he understood that the conflict had become larger than Marley or Paradis. This was especially meaningful during the battle against Eren. Reiner once believed Eren was the enemy he had been sent to capture. Later, Eren became someone he had fought beside, betrayed, and ultimately understood better than almost anyone could. Their relationship had traveled from friendship to hatred, and eventually toward something more complicated. Reiner understood that Eren was also trapped by a world that had given him impossible choices. That did not excuse what Eren did, just as understanding Reiner did not excuse his own actions. But Reiner had finally learned that people could be both victims and perpetrators at the same time. During the final battle, Reiner repeatedly put himself in danger to protect others. The armored Titan, which had once been a symbol of his value as a warrior, became something different. It was no longer simply Marley's weapon. Reiner used it to protect people who had nothing to do with Marley, and who, under different circumstances, might have been his enemies. That transformation gave the armored Titan a completely different meaning. Reiner had inherited the armor because he wanted recognition. He eventually used it because he had something worth protecting. The distinction may seem small, but it represents the entire evolution of his character. The boy who inherited the Titan wanted someone to tell him that he was important. The man who carried it into the final battle already understood that his worth did not depend on recognition. He simply kept going. And that is what makes Reiner's survival so important. After everything he endured, death would have been an easy conclusion to his story. Reiner spent a long time believing that Aang might be the only way to escape his guilt. He had reached a point where he could barely imagine living with his memories, and his suicide attempt demonstrated just how completely hopeless he had become. But Reiner eventually discovered that surviving was not necessarily about forgetting. It was about carrying the past without allowing it to determine every decision. He could not undo Wall Maria. He could not bring Marcel back. He could not erase the people who died because of his actions. He could not become the innocent child he had once been. But he could decide what he did with the life that remained.